Chapter 40. A public dissension, a final appeal. There was no after-theatre lark, however, so far as Carrie was concerned. She made her way homeward, thinking about her absence. Hurstwood was asleep, but roused up to look as she passed through to her own bed. "Is that you?" he said. "Yes," she answered. The next morning at breakfast she felt like apologizing. "I couldn't get home last evening," she said. "Ah, Carrie," he answered, "what's the use saying that? I don't care. You needn't tell me that, though." "I couldn't," said Carrie, her color rising. Then, seeing that he looked as if he said "I know," she exclaimed, "Oh, all right. I don't care." From now on, her indifference to the flat was even greater. There seemed no common ground on which they could talk to one another. She let herself be asked for expenses. It became so with him that he hated to do it. He preferred standing off the butcher and baker. He ran up a grocery bill of $16 with S-log, laying in a supply of staple articles, so that they would not have to buy any of those things for some time to come. Then he changed his grocery. It was the same with the butcher and several others. Carrie never heard anything of this directly from him. He asked for such as he could expect, drifting farther and farther into a situation which could have but one ending. In this fashion, September went by. "Isn't Mr. Drake going to open his hotel?" Carrie asked several times. "Yes. He won't do it before October, though, now." Carrie became disgusted. "Such a man," she said to herself frequently. More and more she visited. She put most of her spare money in clothes, which, after all, was not an astonishing amount. At last the opera she was with announced its departure within 4 weeks. Last 2 weeks of the great comic opera success, the etc., was upon all billboards and in the newspapers, before she acted. "I'm not going out on the road," said Miss Osborne. Carrie went with her to apply to another manager. "Ever had any experience?" was one of his questions. "I'm with the company at the casino now." "Oh, you are?" he said. The end of this was another engagement at 20 per week. Carrie was delighted. She began to feel that she had a place in the world. People recognized ability. So changed was her state that the home atmosphere became intolerable. It was all poverty and trouble there, or seemed to be, because it was a load to bear. It became a place to keep away from. Still she slept there, and did a fair amount of work, keeping it in order. It was a sitting place for Hurstwood. He sat and rocked and read, enveloped in the gloom of his own fate. October went by, and November. It was the dead of winter almost before he knew it, and there he sat. Carrie was doing better, that he knew. Her clothes were improved now, even fine. He saw her coming and going, sometimes picturing to himself her rise. Little eating had thinned him somewhat. He had no appetite. His clothes, too, were a poor man's clothes. Talk about getting something had become even too threadbare and ridiculous for him. So he folded his hands and waited for what he could not anticipate. At last, however, troubles became too thick. The hounding of creditors, the indifference of Carrie, the silence of the flat, and presence of winter, all joined to produce a climax. It was affected by the arrival of S-log, personally, when Carrie was there. "I call about my bill," said Mr. S-log. Carrie was only faintly surprised. "How much is it?" she asked. $16, he replied. "Oh, that much?" said Carrie. "Is this right?" she asked, turning to Hurstwood. "Yes," he said. "Well, I never heard anything about it." She looked as if she thought he had been contracting some needless expense. "Well, we had it all right," he answered. Then he went to the door. "I can't pay you anything on that today," he said, mildly. "Well, when can you?" said the grocer. "Not before Saturday, anyhow," said Hurstwood. "Huh!" returned the grocer. "This is fine. I must have that. I need the money." Carrie was standing farther back in the room, hearing it all. She was greatly distressed. It was so bad and commonplace. Hurstwood was annoyed also. "Well," he said, There's no use talking about it now. If you'll come in Saturday, I'll pay you something on it." The grocery man went away. "How are we going to pay it?" asked Carrie, astonished by the bill. "I can't do it." "Well, you don't have to," he said. "He can't get what he can't get. He'll have to wait." "I don't see how we ran up such a bill as that," said Carrie. "Well, we ate it," said Hurstwood. "It's funny," she replied, still doubting. "What's the use of your standing there and talking like that, now?" he asked. "Do you think I've had it alone? You talk as if I'd taken something." "Well, it's too much, anyhow," said Carrie. "I oughtn't to be made to pay for it. I've got more than I can pay for now." "All right," replied Hurstwood, sitting down in silence. He was sick of the grind of this thing. Carrie went out, and there he sat, determining to do something. There had been appearing in the papers about this time rumors and notices of an approaching strike on the trolley lines in Brooklyn. There was general dissatisfaction as to the hours of labor required and the wages paid. As usual, and for some inexplicable reason, the men chose the winter for the forcing of the hand of their employers and the settlement of their difficulties. Hurstwood had been reading of this thing, and wondering concerning the huge tie-up which would follow. A day or two before this trouble with Carrie, it came. On a cold afternoon, when everything was gray and it threatened to snow, the papers announced that the men had been called out on all the lines. Being so utterly idle, and his mind filled with the numerous predictions which had been made concerning the scarcity of labor this winter and the panicky state of the financial market, Hurstwood read this with interest. He noted the claims of the striking motormen and conductors, who said that they had been wont to receive $2 a day in times past, but that for a year or more trippers had been introduced, which cut down their chance of livelihood one half, and increased their hours of servitude from 10 to 12, and even 14. These trippers were men put on during the busy and rush hours, to take a car out for one trip. The compensation paid for such a trip was only 25 cents. When the rush or busy hours were over, they were laid off. Worst of all, no man might know when he was going to get a car. He must come to the barns in the morning and wait around in fair and foul weather until such time as he was needed. 2 trips were an average reward for so much waiting, a little over 3 hours' work for 50 cents. The work of waiting was not counted. The men complained that this system was extending, and that the time was not far off when but a few out of 7,000 employees would have regular $2 a day work at all. They demanded that the system be abolished, and that 10 hours be considered a day's work, barring unavoidable delays, with $2.25 pay. They demanded immediate acceptance of these terms, which the various trolley companies refused. Hurstwood at first sympathized with the demands of these men. Indeed, it is a question whether he did not always sympathize with them to the end, belie him as his actions might. Reading nearly all the news, he was attracted first by the scareheads with which the trouble was noted in the world. He read it fully, the names of the 7 companies involved, the number of men. "They're foolish to strike in this sort of weather," he thought to himself. "Let 'em win if they can, though." The next day there was even a larger notice of it. "Brooklynites walk," said the World. "Knights of Labor tie up the trolley lines across the bridge. About 7,000 men out." Hurstwood read this, formulating to himself his own idea of what would be the outcome. He was a great believer in the strength of corporations. "They can't win," he said, concerning the men. "They haven't any money. The police will protect the companies. They've got to. The public has to have its cars." He didn't sympathize with the corporations, but strength was with them. So was property and public utility. "Those fellows can't win," he thought. Among other things, he noticed a circular issued by one of the companies, which read, "Atlantic Avenue Railroad Special Notice. The motormen and conductors and other employees of this company having abruptly left its service, an opportunity is now given to all loyal men who have struck against their will to be reinstated, providing they will make their applications by 12 o'clock noon on Wednesday, January 16. Such men will be given employment, with guaranteed protection, in the order in which such applications are received, and runs and positions assign them accordingly. Otherwise, they will be considered discharged, and every vacancy will be filled by a new man as soon as his services can be secured. Signed, Benjamin Norton, President. He also noted among the want ads one which read, "Wanted 50 skilled motormen, accustomed to Westinghouse system, to run U.S. mail cars only, in the city of Brooklyn, protection guaranteed." He noted particularly in each the protection guaranteed. It signified to him the unassailable power of the companies. They've got the militia on their side, he thought. There isn't anything those men can do. While this was still in his mind, the incident with Eslog and Carrie occurred. There had been a good deal to irritate him, but this seemed much the worst. Never before had she accused him of stealing or very near that. She doubted the naturalness of so large a bill. And he had worked so hard to make expenses seem light. He had been doing butcher and baker in order not to call on her. He had eaten very little, almost nothing. "Damn it all," he said. "I can get something. I'm not down yet." He thought that he really must do something now. It was too cheap to sit around after such an insinuation as this. Why, after a little, he would be standing anything. He got up and looked out the window into the chilly street. It came gradually into his mind, as he stood there, to go to Brooklyn. Why not? His mind said. Anyone can get work over there. You'll get 2 a day. How about accidents? Said a voice. You might get hurt. Oh, there won't be much of that, he answered. They've called out the police. Anyone who wants to run a car will be protected all right. You don't know how to run a car, rejoined the voice. I won't apply as a motorman, he answered. I can ring up fares all right. They'll want motormen mostly. They'll take anybody, that I know. For several hours he argued pro and con with this mental counselor, feeling no need to act at once in a matter so sure of profit. In the morning he put on his best clothes, which were poor enough, and began stirring about, putting some bread and meat into a page of a newspaper. Carrie watched him, interested in this new move. Where are you going? She asked. Over to Brooklyn, he answered. Then, seeing her still inquisitive, he added, I think I can get on over there. On the trolley lines? Said Carrie, astonished. Yes, he rejoined. Aren't you afraid? She asked. What of? He answered. The police are protecting them. The paper said 4 men were hurt yesterday. Yes, he returned, but you can't go by what the papers say. They'll run the cars all right. He looked rather determined now, in a desolate sort of way, and Carrie felt very sorry. Something of the old Hurstwood was here, the least shadow of what was once shrewd and pleasant strength. Outside, it was cloudy and blowing a few flakes of snow. What a day to go over there, thought Carrie. Now he left before she did, which was a remarkable thing, and tramped eastward to 14th Street and 6th Avenue, where he took the car. He had read that scores of applicants were applying at the office of the Brooklyn City Railroad building and were being received. He made his way there by horse car and via a dark, silent man to the offices in question. It was a long way, for no cars were running, and the day was cold, but he trudged along grimly. Once in Brooklyn, he could clearly see and feel that a strike was on. People showed it in their manner. Along the routes of certain tracks not a car was running. About certain corners and nearby saloons small groups of men were lounging. Several spring wagons passed him, equipped with plain wooden chairs, and labeled Flatbush or Prospect Park. Fare, 10 cents. He noticed cold and even gloomy faces. Labor was having its little war. When he came near the office in question, he saw a few men standing about, and some policemen. On the far corners were other men whom he took to be strikers watching. All the houses were small and wooden, the streets poorly paved. After New York, Brooklyn looked actually poor and hard up. He made his way into the heart of the small group, eyed by policemen and the men already there. One of the officers addressed him. What are you looking for? I want to see if I can get a place. The offices are up those steps, said the blue coat. His face was a very neutral thing to contemplate. In his heart of hearts, he sympathized with the strikers and hated this scab. In his heart of hearts, also, he felt the dignity and use of the police force, which commanded order. Of its true social significance, he never once dreamed. His was not the mind for that. The two feelings blended in him neutralized one another and him. He would have fought for this man as determinedly as for himself, and yet only so far as commanded. Strip him of his uniform, and he would have soon picked his side. Hurstwood ascended a dusty flight of steps and entered a small, dust-colored office, in which were a railing, a long desk, and several clerks. "Well, sir?" said a middle-aged man, looking up at him from the long desk. "Do you want to hire any men?" inquired Hurstwood. "What are you, a motorman?" "No, I'm not anything," said Hurstwood. He was not at all abashed by his position. He knew these people needed men. If one didn't take him, another would. This man could take him or leave him, just as he chose. "Well, we prefer experienced men, of course," said the man. He paused, while Hurstwood smiled indifferently. Then he added, "Still, I guess you can learn. What is your name?" "Wheeler," said Hurstwood. The man wrote an order on a small card. "Take that to our barns," he said, "and give it to the foreman. He'll show you what to do." Hurstwood went down and out. He walked straight away in the direction indicated, while the policeman looked after. "There's another wants to try it," said Officer Keeley to Officer Macy. "I have my mind he'll get his fill," returned the latter, quietly. They had been in strikes before. Chapter 41. The strike. The barn at which Hurstwood applied was exceedingly short-handed, and was being operated practically by 3 men as directors. There were a lot of green hands around, queer, hungry-looking men, who looked as if want had driven them to desperate means. They tried to be lively and willing, but there was an air of hangdog diffidence about the place. Hurstwood went back through the barns and out into a large, enclosed lot, where were a series of tracks and loops. A half-dozen cars were there, manned by instructors, each with a pupil at the lever. More pupils were waiting at one of the rear doors of the barn. In silence Hurstwood viewed this scene, and waited. His companions took his eye for a while, though they did not interest him much more than the cars. They were an uncomfortable-looking gang, however. 1 or 2 were very thin and lean. Several were quite stout. Several others were raw-boned and sallow, as if they had been beaten upon by all sorts of rough weather. "Did you see by the paper they are going to call out the militia?" Hurstwood heard one of them remark. "Oh, they'll do that," returned the other. "They always do." "Think we're liable to have much trouble?" said another, whom Hurstwood did not see. "Not very. That Scotchman that went out on the last car," put in a voice, "told me that they hit him in the car with a cinder." A small, nervous laugh accompanied this. "One of those fellows on the Fifth Avenue line must have had a hell of a time, according to the papers," drawled another. "They broke his car windows and pulled him off into the street 'fore the police could stop him." "Yes, but there are more police around today," was added by another. Hurstwood hearkened without much mental comment. These talkers seemed scared to him. Their gabbling was feverish things said to quiet their own minds. He looked out into the yard and waited. 2 of the men got around quite near him, but behind his back. They were rather social, and he listened to what they said. "Are you a railroad man?" said one. "Me? No. I've always worked in a paper factory. I had a job in Newark until last October," returned the other, with reciprocal feeling. There were some words which passed too low to hear. Then the conversation became strong again. "I don't blame these fellers for striking," said one. "They've got the right of it, all right, but I had to get something to do." "Same here," said the other. "If I had any job in Newark I wouldn't be over here talking chances like these. It's hell these days, ain't it?" said the man. "A poor man ain't nowhere. You could starve, by God, right in the streets, and there ain't most no one would help you." "Right you are," said the other. "The job I had I lost 'cause they shut down." They run all summer and lay up a big stock, and then shut down. Hurstwood paid some little attention to this. Somehow, he felt a little superior to these two, a little better off. To him these were ignorant and commonplace, poor sheep in a driver's hand. Poor devils, he thought, speaking out of the thoughts and feelings of a bygone period of success. "Next," said one of the instructors. "You're next," said a neighbor, touching him. He went out and climbed on the platform. The instructor took it for granted that no preliminaries were needed. "You see this handle," he said, reaching up to an electric cutoff, which was fastened to the roof. "This throws the current off or on. If you want to reverse the car, you turn it over here. If you want to send it forward, you put it over here. If you want to cut off the power, you keep it in the middle." Hurstwood smiled at the simple information. "Now, this handle here regulates your speed. To here," he said, pointing with his finger, "gives you about 4 miles an hour. This is 8. When it's full on, you make about 14 miles an hour." Hurstwood watched him calmly. He had seen motormen work before. He knew just about how they did it, and was sure he could do as well, with a very little practice. The instructor explained a few more details, and then said, "Now, we'll back her up." Hurstwood stood placidly by, while the car rolled back into the yard. "One thing you want to be careful about, and that is to start easy. Give one degree time to act before you start another. The one fault of most men is that they always want to throw her wide open. That's bad. It's dangerous, too. Wears out the motor. You don't want to do that." "I see," said Hurstwood. He waited and waited, while the man talked on. "Now you take it," he said, finally. The ex-manager laid hand to the lever and pushed it gently, as he thought. It worked much easier than he imagined, however, with the result that the car jerked quickly forward, throwing him back against the door. He straightened up sheepishly, while the instructor stopped the car with the brake. "You want to be careful about that," was all he said. Hurstwood found, however, that handling a brake and regulating speed were not so instantly mastered as he had imagined. Once or twice he would have plowed through the rear fence if it had not been for the hand and word of his companion. The latter was rather patient with him, but he never smiled. "You've got to get the knack of working both arms at once," he said. "It takes a little practice." 1 o'clock came while he was still on the car practicing, and he began to feel hungry. The day set in snowing, and he was cold. He grew weary of running to and fro on the short track. They ran the car to the end and both got off. Hurstwood went into the barn and sought a car step, pulling out his paper-wrapped lunch from his pocket. There was no water and the bread was dry, but he enjoyed it. There was no ceremony about dining. He swallowed and looked about, contemplating the dull, homely labor of the thing. It was disagreeable, miserably disagreeable in all its phases. Not because it was bitter, but because it was hard. It would be hard to anyone, he thought. After reading, he stood about as before, waiting until his turn came. The intention was to give him an afternoon of practice, but the greater part of the time was spent in waiting about. At last evening came, and with it hunger and a debate with himself as to how he should spend the night. It was 5:30. He must soon eat. If he tried to go home, it would take him 2 hours and a half of cold walking and riding. Besides, he had orders to report at 7 the next morning, and going home would necessitate his rising at an unholy and disagreeable hour. He had only something like $1.15 of Carrie's money, with which he had intended to pay the 2 weeks' coal bill before the present idea struck him. They must have some place around here, he thought. Where does that fellow from Newark stay? Finally he decided to ask. There was a young fellow standing near one of the doors in the cold, waiting a last turn. He was a mere boy in years 21 about, but with a body lank and long, because of privation. A little good living would have made this youth plump and swaggering. "How do they arrange this, if a man hasn't any money?" inquired Hurstwood, discreetly. The fellow turned a keen, watchful face on the inquirer. "You mean eat?" he replied. "Yes, and sleep. I can't go back to New York tonight." The foreman'll fix that if you ask him, I guess. He did me. That so? Yes. I just told him I didn't have anything. Gee, I couldn't go home. I live way over in Hoboken. Hurstwood only cleared his throat by way of acknowledgement. They've got a place upstairs here, I understand. I don't know what sort of a thing it is. Pretty tough, I guess. He gave me a meal ticket this noon. I know that wasn't much. Hurstwood smiled grimly, and the boy laughed. It ain't no fun, is it? He inquired, wishing vainly for a cheery reply. Not much, answered Hurstwood. I'd tackle him now, volunteered the youth. He may go away. Hurstwood did so. Isn't there some place I can stay around here tonight? He inquired. If I have to go back to New York, I'm afraid I won't. There are some cots upstairs, interrupted the man, if you want one of them. That'll do, he assented. He meant to ask for a meal ticket, but the seemingly proper moment never came, and he decided to pay himself that night. I'll ask him in the morning. He ate in a cheap restaurant in the vicinity, and, being cold and lonely, went straight off to seek the loft in question. The company was not attempting to run cars after nightfall. It was so advised by the police. The room seemed to have been a lounging place for night workers. There were some 9 cots in the place, 2 or 3 wooden chairs, a soap box, and a small, round-bellied stove, in which a fire was blazing. Early as he was called, another man was there before him. The latter was sitting beside the stove warming his hands. Hurstwood approached and held out his own toward the fire. He was sick of the bareness and privation of all things connected with his venture, but was steeling himself to hold out. He fancied he could for a while. "Cold, isn't it?" said the early guest. "Rather." A long silence. "Not much of a place to sleep in, is it?" said the man. "Better than nothing," replied Hurstwood. Another silence. "I believe I'll turn in," said the man. Rising, he went to one of the cots and stretched himself, removing only his shoes, and pulling the one blanket and dirty old comforter over him in a sort of bundle. The sight disgusted Hurstwood, but he did not dwell on it, choosing to gaze into the stove and think of something else. Presently he decided to retire, and picked a cot, also removing his shoes. While he was doing so, the youth who had advised him to come here entered, and, seeing Hurstwood, tried to be genial. "Better'n nothin'," he observed, looking around. Hurstwood did not take this to himself. He thought it to be an expression of individual satisfaction, and so did not answer. The youth imagined he was out of sorts, and set to whistling softly. Seeing another man asleep, he quit that and lapsed into silence. Hurstwood made the best of a bad lot by keeping on his clothes and pushing away the dirty covering from his head, but at last he dozed in sheer weariness. The covering became more and more comfortable, its character was forgotten, and he pulled it about his neck and slept. In the morning he was aroused out of a pleasant dream by several men stirring about in the cold, cheerless room. He had been back in Chicago in fancy, in his own comfortable home. Jessica had been arranging to go somewhere, and he had been talking with her about it. This was so clear in his mind, that he was startled now by the contrast of this room. He raised his head, and the cold, bitter reality jarred him into wakefulness. "Guess I'd better get up," he said. There was no water on this floor. He put on his shoes in the cold and stood up, shaking himself in his stiffness. His clothes felt disagreeable, his hair bad. "Hell!" he muttered, as he put on his hat. Downstairs things were stirring again. He found a hydrant, with a trough which had once been used for horses, but there was no towel here, and his handkerchief was soiled from yesterday. He contented himself with wetting his eyes with the ice-cold water. Then he sought the foreman, who was already on the ground. "Had your breakfast yet?" inquired that worthy. "No," said Hurstwood. "Better get it, then. Your car won't be ready for a little while." Hurstwood hesitated. "Could you let me have a meal ticket?" he asked, with an effort. "Here you are," said the man, handing him one. He breakfasted as poorly as the night before on some fried steak and bad coffee. Then he went back. "Here, said the foreman, motioning him, when he came in. "You take this car out in a few minutes." Hurstwood climbed up on the platform in the gloomy barn and waited for a signal. He was nervous, and yet the thing was a relief. Anything was better than the barn. On this, the fourth day of the strike, the situation had taken a turn for the worse. The strikers, following the counsel of their leaders and the newspapers, had struggled peaceably enough. There had been no great violence done. Cars had been stopped, it is true, and the men argued with. Some crews had been won over and led away, some windows broken, some jeering and yelling done, but in no more than 5 or 6 instances had men been seriously injured. These by crowds whose acts the leaders disclaimed. Idleness, however, and the sight of the company, backed by the police, triumphing, angered the men. They saw that each day more cars were going on, each day more declarations were being made by the company officials that the effective opposition of the strikers was broken. This put desperate thoughts in the minds of the men. Peaceful methods meant, they saw, that the companies would soon run all their cars and those who had complained would be forgotten. There was nothing so helpful to the companies as peaceful methods. All at once they blazed forth, and for a week there was storm and stress. Cars were assailed, men attacked, policemen struggled with, tracks torn up, and shots fired, until at last street fights and mob movements became frequent, and the city was invested with militia. Hurstwood knew nothing of the change of temper. "Run your car out," called the foreman, waving a vigorous hand at him. A green conductor jumped up behind and rang the bell twice as a signal to start. Hurstwood turned the lever and ran the car out through the door into the street in front of the barn. Here 2 brawny policemen got up beside him on the platform on either hand. At the sound of a gong near the barn door, 2 bells were given by the conductor and Hurstwood opened his lever. The 2 policemen looked about them calmly. "'Tis cold, all right, this morning," said the one on the left, who possessed a rich brogue. "I had enough of it yesterday," said the other. "I wouldn't want a steady job of this." "Nor I." Neither paid the slightest attention to Hurstwood, who stood facing the cold wind, which was chilling him completely, and thinking of his orders. "Keep a steady gait," the foreman had said. "Don't stop for anyone who doesn't look like a real passenger. Whatever you do, don't stop for a crowd." The 2 officers kept silent for a few moments. "The last man must have gone through all right," said the officer on the left. "I don't see his car anywhere." "Who's on there?" asked the second officer, referring, of course, to its complement of policemen. "Schaefer and Ryan." There was another silence, in which the car ran smoothly along. There were not so many houses along this part of the way. Hurstwood did not see many people either. The situation was not wholly disagreeable to him. He would do well enough. He was brought out of this feeling by the sudden appearance of a curve ahead, which he had not expected. He shut off the current and did an energetic turn at the brake, but not in time to avoid an unnaturally quick turn. It shook him up and made him feel like making apologetic remarks, but he refrained. "You want to look out for them things," said the officer on the left, condescendingly. "That's right," agreed Hurstwood, shamefacedly. "There's lots of them on this line," said the officer on the right. Around the corner a more populated way appeared. 1 or 2 pedestrians were in view ahead. A boy coming out of a gate with a tin milk bucket gave Hurstwood his first objectionable greeting. "Scab!" he yelled. "Scab!" Hurstwood heard it, but tried to make no comment, even to himself. He knew he would get that, and much more of the same sort, probably. At a corner farther up a man stood by the track and signaled the car to stop. "Never mind him," said one of the officers. "He's up to some game." Hurstwood obeyed. At the corner he saw the wisdom of it. No sooner did the man perceive the intention to ignore him, than he shook his fist. "Ah, you bloody coward!" he yelled. Some 6 men, standing on the corner, flung taunts and jeers after the speeding car. Hurstwood winced the least bit. The real thing was slightly worse than the thoughts of it had been. Now came in sight, 3 or 4 blocks farther on, a heap of something on the track. They've been at work, here. All right, said one of the policemen. We'll have an argument, maybe, said the other. Hurstwood ran the car close and stopped. He had not done so wholly, however, before a crowd gathered about. It was composed of ex-motormen and conductors in part, with a sprinkling of friends and sympathizers. Come off the car, pardner, said one of the men in a voice meant to be conciliatory. You don't want to take the bread out of another man's mouth, do you? Hurstwood held to his brake and lever, pale and very uncertain what to do. Stand back, yelled one of the officers, leaning over the platform railing. Clear out of this, now. Give the man a chance to do his work. Listen, pardner, said the leader, ignoring the policeman and addressing Hurstwood. We're all working men, like yourself. If you were a regular motorman, and had been treated as we've been, you wouldn't want anyone to come in and take your place, would you? You wouldn't want anyone to do you out of your chance to get your rights, would you? Shut her off. Shut her off, urged the other of the policemen, roughly. Get out of this, now, and he jumped the railing and landed before the crowd and began shoving. Instantly the other officer was down beside him. Stand back, now, they yelled. Get out of this. What the hell do you mean? Out, now. It was like a small swarm of bees. Don't shove me, said one of the strikers, determinedly. I'm not doing anything. Get out of this, cried the officer, swinging his club. I'll give ye a bat on the sconce. Back, now. What the hell? Cried another of the strikers, pushing the other way, adding at the same time some lusty oaths. Crack came an officer's club on his forehead. He blinked his eyes blindly a few times, wobbled on his legs, threw up his hands, and staggered back. In return, a swift fist landed on the officer's neck. Infuriated by this, the latter plunged left and right, laying about madly with his club. He was ably assisted by his brother of the blue, who poured ponderous oaths upon the troubled waters. No severe damage was done, owing to the agility of the strikers in keeping out of reach. They stood about the sidewalk now and jeered. Where is the conductor? Yelled one of the officers, getting his eye on that individual, who had come nervously forward to stand by Hurstwood. The latter had stood gazing upon the scene with more astonishment than fear. Why don't you come down here and get these stones off the track? Inquired the officer. What you standing there for? Do you want to stay here all day? Get down. Hurstwood breathed heavily in excitement and jumped down with the nervous conductor as if he had been called. Hurry up, now, said the other policeman. Cold as it was, these officers were hot and mad. Hurstwood worked with the conductor, lifting stone after stone and warming himself by the work. Ah, you scab, you! Yelled the crowd. You coward! Steal a man's job, will you? Rob the poor, will you, you thief? We'll get you yet, now. Wait. Not all of this was delivered by one man. It came from here and there, incorporated with much more of the same sort and curses. Work, you blackguards, yelled a voice. Do the dirty work. You're the suckers that keep the poor people down. May God starve ye yet, yelled an old Irish woman, who now threw open a nearby window and stuck out her head. Yes, and you, she added, catching the eye of one of the policemen. You bloody, murtherin' thief. Crack my son over the head, will you, you hard-hearted, murtherin' divil? Ah, ye, but the officer turned a deaf ear. Go to the devil, you old hag, he half muttered as he stared round upon the scattered company. Now the stones were off, and Hurstwood took his place again amid a continued chorus of epithets. Both officers got up beside him and the conductor rang the bell, when, bang! Bang! Through window and door came rocks and stones. One narrowly grazed Hurstwood's head. Another shattered the window behind. Throw open your lever, yelled one of the officers, grabbing at the handle himself. Hurstwood complied and the car shot away, followed by a rattle of stones and a rain of curses. That, hit me in the neck, said one of the officers. I gave him a good crack for it, though. I think I must have left spots on some of them, said the other. "I know that big guy that called us said the first. "I'll get him yet for that." "I thought we were in for it sure, once there," said the second. Hurstwood, warmed and excited, gazed steadily ahead. It was an astonishing experience for him. He had read of these things, but the reality seemed something altogether new. He was no coward in spirit. The fact that he had suffered this much now rather operated to arouse a stolid determination to stick it out. He did not recur in thought to New York or the flat. This one trip seemed a consuming thing. They now ran into the business heart of Brooklyn uninterrupted. People gazed at the broken windows of the car and at Hurstwood in his plain clothes. Voices called "scab" now and then, as well as other epithets, but no crowd attacked the car. At the downtown end of the line, one of the officers went to call up his station and report the trouble. "There's a gang out there," he said, "laying for us yet. Better send someone over there and clean them out." The car ran back more quietly, hooted, watched, flung at, but not attacked. Hurstwood breathed freely when he saw the barns. "Well," he observed to himself, "I came out of that all right." The car was turned in and he was allowed to loaf a while, but later he was again called. This time a new team of officers was aboard. Slightly more confident, he sped the car along the commonplace streets and felt somewhat less fearful. On one side, however, he suffered intensely. The day was raw, with a sprinkling of snow and a gusty wind, made all the more intolerable by the speed of the car. His clothing was not intended for this sort of work. He shivered, stamped his feet, and beat his arms as he had seen other motormen do in the past, but said nothing. The novelty and danger of the situation modified in a way his disgust and distress at being compelled to be here, but not enough to prevent him from feeling grim and sour. This was a dog's life, he thought. It was a tough thing to have to come to. The one thought that strengthened him was the insult offered by Carrie. He was not down so low as to take all that, he thought. He could do something even for a while. It would get better. He would save a little. A boy threw a clod of mud while he was thus reflecting and hit him upon the arm. It hurt sharply and angered him more than he had been any time since morning. "The little cur," he muttered. "Hurt you?" asked one of the policemen. "No," he answered. At one of the corners, where the car slowed up because of a turn, an ex-motorman, standing on the sidewalk, called to him, "Won't you come out, pardner, and be a man? Remember, we're fighting for decent day's wages, that's all. We've got families to support." The man seemed most peaceably inclined. Hurstwood pretended not to see him. He kept his eyes straight on before and opened the lever wide. The voice had something appealing in it. All morning this went on and long into the afternoon. He made 3 such trips. The dinner he had was no stay for such work and the cold was telling on him. At each end of the line he stopped to thaw out, but he could have groaned at the anguish of it. One of the barnmen, out of pity, loaned him a heavy cap and a pair of sheepskin gloves, and for once he was extremely thankful. On the second trip of the afternoon he ran into a crowd about halfway along the line, that had blocked the car's progress with an old telegraph pole. "Get that thing off the track," shouted the 2 policemen. "Yeah, yeah, yeah," yelled the crowd. "Get it off yourself." The 2 policemen got down and Hurstwood started to follow. "You stay there," one called. "Someone will run away with your car." Amid the babel of voices, Hurstwood heard one close beside him. "Come down, pardner, and be a man. Don't fight the poor. Leave that to the corporations." He saw the same fellow who had called to him from the corner. Now, as before, he pretended not to hear him. "Come down," the man repeated gently. "You don't want to fight poor men. Don't fight at all." It was a most philosophic and jesuitical motorman. A 3rd policeman joined the other 2 from somewhere and someone ran to telephone for more officers. Hurstwood gazed about, determined but fearful. A man grabbed him by the coat. "Come off of that," he exclaimed, jerking at him and trying to pull him over the railing. "Let go," said Hurstwood, savagely. "I'll show you, you scab!" cried a young Irishman, jumping up on the car and aiming a blow at Hurstwood. The latter ducked and caught it on the shoulder instead of the jaw. "Away from here," shouted an officer, hastening to the rescue, and adding, "Of course, the usual oaths." Hurstwood recovered himself, pale and trembling. It was becoming serious with him now. People were looking up and peering at him. One girl was making faces. He began to waver in his resolution, when a patrol wagon rolled up and more officers dismounted. Now the track was quickly cleared and the release effected. "Let her go now, quick," said the officer, and again he was off. The end came with a real mob, which met the car on its return trip a mile or two from the barns. It was an exceedingly poor-looking neighborhood. He wanted to run fast through it, but again the track was blocked. He saw men carrying something out to it when he was yet a half-dozen blocks away. "There they are again!" exclaimed one policeman. "I'll give them something this time," said the second officer, whose patience was becoming worn. Hurstwood suffered a qualm of body as the car rolled up. As before, the crowd began hooting, but now, rather than come near, they threw things. One or two windows were smashed and Hurstwood dodged a stone. Both policemen ran out toward the crowd, but the latter replied by running toward the car. A woman, a mere girl in appearance, was among these, bearing a rough stick. She was exceedingly wrathful and struck at Hurstwood, who dodged. Thereupon, her companions, duly encouraged, jumped on the car and pulled Hurstwood over. He had hardly time to speak or shout before he fell. "Let go of me," he said, falling on his side. "Ah, you sucker," he heard someone say. Kicks and blows rained on him. He seemed to be suffocating. Then two men seemed to be dragging him off and he wrestled for freedom. "Let up," said a voice, "you're all right. Stand up." He was let loose and recovered himself. Now he recognized two officers. He felt as if he would faint from exhaustion. Something was wet on his chin. He put up his hand and felt, then looked. It was red. "They cut me," he said, foolishly, fishing for his handkerchief. Now, said one of the officers. "It's only a scratch." His senses became cleared now and he looked around. He was standing in a little store, where they left him for the moment. Outside, he could see, as he stood wiping his chin, the car and the excited crowd. A patrol wagon was there, and another. He walked over and looked out. It was an ambulance, backing in. He saw some energetic charging by the police and arrests being made. "Come on, now, if you want to take your car," said an officer, opening the door and looking in. He walked out, feeling rather uncertain of himself. He was very cold and frightened. "Where's the conductor?" he asked. "Oh, he's not here now," said the policeman. Hurstwood went toward the car and stepped nervously on. As he did so there was a pistol shot. Something stung his shoulder. "Who fired that?" he heard an officer exclaim. "By God! Who did that?" Both left him, running toward a certain building. He paused a moment and then got down. "George!" exclaimed Hurstwood, weakly, "this is too much for me." He walked nervously to the corner and hurried down a side street. "Phew!" he said, drawing in his breath. A half-block away, a small girl gazed at him. "You'd better sneak," she called. He walked homeward in a blinding snowstorm, reaching the ferry by dusk. The cabins were filled with comfortable souls, who studied him curiously. His head was still in such a whirl that he felt confused. All the wonder of the twinkling lights of the river in a white storm passed for nothing. He trudged doggedly on until he reached the flat. There he entered and found the room warm. Carrie was gone. A couple of evening papers were lying on the table where she left them. He lit the gas and sat down. Then he got up and stripped to examine his shoulder. It was a mere scratch. He washed his hands and face, still in a brown study, apparently, and combed his hair. Then he looked for something to eat, and finally, his hunger gone, sat down in his comfortable rocking chair. It was a wonderful relief. He put his hand to his chin, forgetting, for the moment, the papers. "Well," he said, after a time, his nature recovering itself, That's a pretty tough game over there. Then he turned and saw the papers. With half a sigh he picked up the World. Strike spreading in Brooklyn, he read. Rioting breaks out in all parts of the city. He adjusted his paper very comfortably and continued. It was the one thing he read with absorbing interest. Chapter 42. A touch of spring, the empty shell. Those who look upon Hurstwood's Brooklyn venture as an error of judgment will nonetheless realize the negative influence on him of the fact that he had tried and failed. Carrie got a wrong idea of it. He said so little that she imagined he had encountered nothing worse than the ordinary roughness. Quitting so soon in the face of this seemed trifling. He did not want to work. She was now one of a group of Oriental beauties who, in the second act of the comic opera, were paraded by the vizier before the new potentate as the treasures of his harem. There was no word assigned to any of them, but on the evening when Hurstwood was housing himself in the loft of the streetcar barn, the leading comedian and star, feeling exceedingly facetious, said in a profound voice, which created a ripple of laughter, "Well, who are you?" It merely happened to be Carrie who was courtesying before him. It might as well have been any of the others, so far as he was concerned. He expected no answer and a dull one would have been reproved. But Carrie, whose experience and belief in herself gave her daring, courtesied sweetly again and answered, "I am yours truly." It was a trivial thing to say, and yet something in the way she did it caught the audience, which laughed heartily at the mock fierce potentate towering before the young woman. The comedian also liked it, hearing the laughter. "I thought your name was Smith," he returned, endeavoring to get the last laugh. Carrie almost trembled for her daring after she had said this. All members of the company had been warned that to interpolate lines or business meant a fine or worse. She did not know what to think. As she was standing in her proper position in the wings, awaiting another entry, the great comedian made his exit past her and paused in recognition. "You can just leave that in hereafter," he remarked, seeing how intelligent she appeared. "Don't add any more, though." "Thank you," said Carrie, humbly. When he went on she found herself trembling violently. "Well, you're in luck," remarked another member of the chorus. "There isn't another one of us has got a line." There was no gainsaying the value of this. Everybody in the company realized that she had got a start. Carrie hugged herself when next evening the lines got the same applause. She went home rejoicing, knowing that soon something must come of it. It was Hurstwood who, by his presence, caused her merry thoughts to flee and replaced them with sharp longings for an end of distress. The next day she asked him about his venture. "They're not trying to run any cars except with police. They don't want anybody just now, not before next week." Next week came, but Carrie saw no change. Hurstwood seemed more apathetic than ever. He saw her off mornings to rehearsals and the like with the utmost calm. He read and read. Several times he found himself staring at an item, but thinking of something else. The first of these lapses that he sharply noticed concerned a hilarious party he had once attended at a driving club, of which he had been a member. He sat, gazing downward, and gradually thought he heard the old voices and the clink of glasses. "You're a dandy, Hurstwood," his friend Walker said. He was standing again well dressed, smiling, good-natured, the recipient of encores for a good story. All at once he looked up. The room was so still it seemed ghost-like. He heard the clock ticking audibly and half suspected that he had been dozing. The paper was so straight in his hands, however, and the items he had been reading so directly before him, that he rid himself of the doze idea. Still, it seemed peculiar. When it occurred a second time, however, it did not seem quite so strange. Butcher and grocery man, baker and coal man, not the group with whom he was then dealing, but those who had trusted him to the limit, called. He met them all blandly, becoming deft in excuse. At last he became bold, pretended to be out, or waved them off. "They can't get blood out of a turnip," he said. "If I had it I'd pay them." Carrie's little soldier friend, Miss Osborne, seeing her succeeding, had become a sort of satellite. Little Osborne could never of herself amount to anything. She seemed to realize it in a sort of pussy-like way and instinctively concluded to cling with her soft little claws to Carrie. "Oh, you'll get up," she kept telling Carrie with admiration. "You're so good." Timid as Carrie was, she was strong in capability. The reliance of others made her feel as if she must, and when she must she dared. Experience of the world and of necessity was in her favor. No longer the lightest word of a man made her head dizzy. She had learned that men could change and fail. Flattery in its most palpable form had lost its force with her. It required superiority, kindly superiority, to move her, the superiority of a genius like Ames. "I don't like the actors in our company," she told Lola one day. "They're all so stuck on themselves." "Don't you think Mr. Barclay's pretty nice?" inquired Lola, who had received a condescending smile or two from that quarter. "Oh, he's nice enough," answered Carrie, "but he isn't sincere. He assumes such an air." Lola felt for her first hold upon Carrie in the following manner: "Are you paying room rent where you are?" "Certainly," answered Carrie. "Why?" "I know where I could get the loveliest room and bath, cheap. It's too big for me, but it would be just right for two, and the rent is only $6 a week for both." "Where?" said Carrie. "In 17th Street. "Well, I don't know as I'd care to change," said Carrie, who was already turning over the $3 rate in her mind. She was thinking if she had only herself to support this would leave her 17 for herself. Nothing came of this until after the Brooklyn adventure of Hurstwood's and her success with the speaking part. Then she began to feel as if she must be free. She thought of leaving Hurstwood and thus making him act for himself, but he had developed such peculiar traits she feared he might resist any effort to throw him off. He might hunt her out at the show and hound her in that way. She did not wholly believe that he would, but he might. This, she knew, would be an embarrassing thing if he made himself conspicuous in any way. It troubled her greatly. Things were precipitated by the offer of a better part. One of the actresses playing the part of a modest sweetheart gave notice of leaving and Carrie was selected. "How much are you going to get?" asked Miss Osborne, on hearing the good news. "I didn't ask him," said Carrie. "Well, find out." "Goodness, you'll never get anything if you don't ask. Tell them you must have $40, anyhow." "Oh, no," said Carrie. "Certainly," exclaimed Lola. "Ask 'em, anyway." Carrie succumbed to this prompting, waiting, however, until the manager gave her notice of what clothing she must have to fit the part. "How much do I get?" she inquired. $35, he replied. Carrie was too much astonished and delighted to think of mentioning 40. She was nearly beside herself, and almost hugged Lola, who clung to her at the news. "It isn't as much as you ought to get," said the latter, "especially when you've got to buy clothes." Carrie remembered this with a start. Where to get the money? She had none laid up for such an emergency. Rent day was drawing near. "I'll not do it," she said, remembering her necessity. "I don't use the flat. I'm not going to give up my money this time. I'll move." Fitting into this came another appeal from Miss Osborne, more urgent than ever. "Come live with me, won't you?" she pleaded. "We can have the loveliest room. It won't cost you hardly anything that way." "I'd like to," said Carrie, frankly. "Oh, do," said Lola. "We'll have such a good time." Carrie thought a while. "I believe I will," she said, and then added, "I'll have to see first, though." With the idea thus grounded, rent day approaching, and clothes calling for instant purchase, she soon found excuse in Hurstwood's lassitude. He said less and drooped more than ever. As rent day approached, an idea grew in him. It was fostered by the demands of creditors and the impossibility of holding up many more. $28 was too much for rent. "It's hard on her," he thought. "We could get a cheaper place." Stirred with this idea, he spoke at the breakfast table. "Don't you think we pay too much rent here?" he asked. "Indeed I do," said Carrie, not catching his drift. "I should think we could get a smaller place," he suggested. "We don't need 4 rooms." Her countenance, had he been scrutinizing her, would have exhibited the disturbance she felt at this evidence of his determination to stay by her. He saw nothing remarkable in asking her to come down lower. "Oh, I don't know," she answered, growing wary. "There must be places around here where we could get a couple of rooms, which would do just as well." Her heart revolted. Never. She thought. Who would furnish the money to move? To think of being in 2 rooms with him. She resolved to spend her money for clothes quickly, before something terrible happened. That very day she did it. Having done so, there was but one other thing to do. "Lola," she said, visiting her friend, "I think I'll come." "Oh, jolly!" cried the latter. "Can we get it right away?" she asked, meaning the room. "Certainly," cried Lola. They went to look at it. Carrie had saved $10 from her expenditure as enough for this and her board beside. Her enlarged salary would not begin for 10 days yet would not reach her for 17. She paid half of the $6 with her friend. "Now, I've just enough to get on to the end of the week," she confided. "Oh, I've got some," said Lola. "I've got $25, if you need it." "No," said Carrie. "I guess I'll get along." They decided to move Friday, which was 2 days away. Now that the thing was settled, Carrie's heart misgave her. She felt very much like a criminal in the matter. Each day looking at Hurstwood, she had realized that, along with the disagreeableness of his attitude, there was something pathetic. She looked at him the same evening she had made up her mind to go, and now he seemed not so shiftless and worthless, but run down and beaten upon by chance. His eyes were not keen, his face marked, his hands flabby. She thought his hair had a touch of gray. All unconscious of his doom, he rocked and read his paper, while she glanced at him. Knowing that the end was so near, she became rather solicitous. "Will you go over and get some canned peaches?" she asked Hurstwood, laying down a $2 bill. "Certainly," he said, looking in wonder at the money. "See if you can get some nice asparagus," she added. "I'll cook it for dinner." Hurstwood rose and took the money, slipping on his overcoat and getting his hat. Carrie noticed that both of these articles of apparel were old and poor-looking in appearance. It was plain enough before, but now it came home with peculiar force. Perhaps he couldn't help it, after all. He had done well in Chicago. She remembered his fine appearance the days he had met her in the park. Then he was so sprightly, so clean. Had it been all his fault? He came back and laid the change down with the food. "You'd better keep it," she observed. "We'll need other things." "No," he said, with a sort of pride, "you keep it." "Oh, go on and keep it," she replied, rather unnerved. "There'll be other things." He wondered at this, not knowing the pathetic figure he had become in her eyes. She restrained herself with difficulty from showing a quaver in her voice. To say truly, this would have been Carrie's attitude in any case. She had looked back at times upon her parting from Druitt and had regretted that she had served him so badly. She hoped she would never meet him again, but she was ashamed of her conduct. Not that she had any choice in the final separation. She had gone willingly to seek him, with sympathy in her heart, when Hurstwood had reported him ill. There was something cruel somewhere, and not being able to track it mentally to its logical lair, she concluded with feeling that he would never understand what Hurstwood had done and would see hard-hearted decision in her deed, hence her shame. Not that she cared for him. She did not want to make anyone who had been good to her feel badly. She did not realize what she was doing by allowing these feelings to possess her. Hurstwood, noticing the kindness, conceived better of her. Carrie's good-natured, anyhow, he thought. Going to Miss Osborne's that afternoon, she found that little lady packing and singing. "Why don't you come over with me today?" she asked. "Oh, I can't," said Carrie. "I'll be there Friday. Would you mind lending me the $25 you spoke of?" "Why, no," said Lola, going for her purse. "I want to get some other things," said Carrie. "Oh, that's all right," answered the little girl, good-naturedly, glad to be of service. It had been days since Hurstwood had done more than go to the grocery or to the newsstand. Now the weariness of indoors was upon him had been for 2 days, but chill, grey weather had held him back. Friday broke fair and warm. It was one of those lovely harbingers of spring, given as a sign in dreary winter that earth is not forsaken of warmth and beauty. The blue heaven, holding its one golden orb, poured down a crystal wash of warm light. It was plain, from the voice of the sparrows, that all was halcyon outside. Carrie raised the front windows, and felt the south wind blowing. "It's lovely out today," she remarked. "Is it?" said Hurstwood. After breakfast, he immediately got his other clothes. "Will you be back for lunch?" asked Carrie, nervously. "No," he said. He went out into the streets and tramped north, along 7th Avenue, idly fixing upon the Harlem River as an objective point. He had seen some ships up there, the time he had called upon the Brewers. He wondered how the territory thereabouts was growing. Passing 59th Street, he took the west side of Central Park, which he followed to 78th Street. Then he remembered the neighborhood and turned over to look at the mass of buildings erected. It was very much improved. The great open spaces were filling up. Coming back, he kept to the park until 110th Street, and then turned into 7th Avenue again, reaching the pretty river by 1 o'clock. There it ran winding before his gaze, shining brightly in the clear light, between the undulating banks on the right and the tall, tree-covered heights on the left. The spring-like atmosphere woke him to a sense of its loveliness, and for a few moments he stood looking at it, folding his hands behind his back. Then he turned and followed it toward the east side, idly seeking the ships he had seen. It was 4 o'clock before the waning day, with its suggestion of a cooler evening, caused him to return. He was hungry and would enjoy eating in the warm room. When he reached the flat by 5:30, it was still dark. He knew that Carrie was not there, not only because there was no light showing through the transom, but because the evening papers were stuck between the outside knob and the door. He opened with his key and went in. Everything was still dark. Lighting the gas, he sat down, preparing to wait a little while. Even if Carrie did come now, dinner would be late. He read until 6, then got up to fix something for himself. As he did so, he noticed that the room seemed a little queer. What was it? He looked around, as if he missed something, and then saw an envelope near where he had been sitting. It spoke for itself, almost without further action on his part. Reaching over, he took it, a sort of chill settling upon him even while he reached. The crackle of the envelope in his hands was loud. Green paper money lay soft within the note. "Dear George," he read, crunching the money in one hand. "I'm going away. I'm not coming back anymore. It's no use trying to keep up the flat, I can't do it. I wouldn't mind helping you, if I could, but I can't support us both, and pay the rent. I need what little I make to pay for my clothes. I'm leaving $20. It's all I have just now. You can do whatever you like with the furniture. I won't want it. Carrie." He dropped the note and looked quietly round. Now he knew what he missed. It was the little ornamental clock, which was hers. It had gone from the mantelpiece. He went into the front room, his bedroom, the parlor, lighting the gas as he went. From the chiffonier had gone the knickknacks of silver and plate. From the tabletop, the lace coverings. He opened the wardrobe, no clothes of hers. He opened the drawers, nothing of hers. Her trunk was gone from its accustomed place. Back in his own room hung his old clothes, just as he had left them. Nothing else was gone. He stepped onto the parlor and stood for a few moments looking vacantly at the floor. The silence grew oppressive. The little flat seemed wonderfully deserted. He wholly forgot that he was hungry, that it was only dinner time. It seemed later in the night. Suddenly, he found that the money was still in his hands. There were $20 in all, as she had said. Now he walked back, leaving the lights ablaze, and feeling as if the flat were empty. "I'll get out of this," he said to himself. Then the sheer loneliness of his situation rushed upon him in full. "Left me," he muttered, and repeated, "left me." The place that had been so comfortable, where he had spent so many days of warmth, was now a memory. Something colder and chillier confronted him. He sank down in his chair, resting his chin in his hand, mere sensation, without thought, holding him. Then something like a bereaved affection and self-pity swept over him. "She needn't have gone away," he said. "I'd have got something." He sat a long while without rocking, and added quite clearly, out loud, "I tried, didn't I?" At midnight he was still rocking, staring at the floor. Chapter 43. The world turns flatterer, an eye in the dark. Installed in her comfortable room, Carrie wondered how Hurstwood had taken her departure. She arranged a few things hastily and then left for the theater, half expecting to encounter him at the door. Not finding him, her dread lifted, and she felt more kindly toward him. She quite forgot him until about to come out, after the show, when the chance of his being there frightened her. As day after day passed and she heard nothing at all, the thought of being bothered by him passed. In a little while she was, except for occasional thoughts, wholly free of the gloom with which her life had been weighed in the flat. It is curious to note how quickly a profession absorbs one. Carrie became wise in theatrical lore, hearing the gossip of little Lola. She learned what the theatrical papers were, which ones published items about actresses and the like. She began to read the newspaper notices, not only of the opera in which she had so small a part, but of others. Gradually the desire for notice took hold of her. She longed to be renowned like others, and read with avidity all the complimentary or critical comments made concerning others high in her profession. The showy world in which her interest lay completely absorbed her. It was about this time that the newspapers and magazines were beginning to pay that illustrative attention to the beauties of the stage which has since become fervid. The newspapers, and particularly the Sunday newspapers, indulged in large decorative theatrical pages, in which the faces and forms of well-known theatrical celebrities appeared, enclosed with artistic scrolls. The magazines also, or at least one or two of the newer ones, published occasional portraits of pretty stars, and now and again photos of scenes from various plays. Carrie watched these with growing interest. When would a scene from her opera appear? When would some paper think her photo worthwhile? The Sunday before taking her new part she scanned the theatrical pages for some little notice. It would have accorded with her expectations if nothing had been said, but there in the squibs, tailing off several more substantial items, was a wee notice. Carrie read it with a tingling body. The part of Katisha, the country maid, in The Wives of Abdul at the Broadway, heretofore played by Inez Carew, will be hereafter filled by Carrie Madenda, one of the cleverest members of the chorus. Carrie hugged herself with delight. Oh, wasn't it just fine? At last. The first, the long-hoped-for, the delightful notice. And they called her clever. She could hardly restrain herself from laughing loudly. Had Lola seen it? "They've got a notice here of the part I'm going to play tomorrow night," said Carrie to her friend. "Oh, jolly. Have they?" cried Lola, running to her. "That's all right," she said, looking. "You'll get more now, if you do well. I had my picture in the World once." "Did you?" asked Carrie. "Did I? Well, I should say," returned the little girl. "They had a frame around it." Carrie laughed. "They've never published my picture." "But they will," said Lola. "You'll see. You do better than most that get theirs in now." Carrie felt deeply grateful for this. She almost loved Lola for the sympathy and praise she extended. It was so helpful to her, so almost necessary. Fulfilling her part capably brought another notice in the papers that she was doing her work acceptably. This pleased her immensely. She began to think the world was taking note of her. The first week she got her $35, it seemed an enormous sum. Paving only $3 for room rent seemed ridiculous. After giving Lola her $25, she still had $7 left. With $4 left over from previous earnings, she had $11. $5 of this went to pay the regular installment on the clothes she had to buy. The next week she was even in greater feather. Now, only $3 need be paid for room rent and $5 on her clothes. The rest she had for food and her own whims. "You'd better save a little for summer," cautioned Lola. We'll probably close in May. I intend to, said Carrie. The regular entrance of $35 a week to one who has endured scant allowances for several years is a demoralizing thing. Carrie found her purse bursting with good green bills of comfortable denominations. Having no one dependent upon her, she began to buy pretty clothes and pleasing trinkets, to eat well, and to ornament her room. Friends were not long in gathering about. She met a few young men who belonged to Lola's staff. The members of the opera company made her acquaintance without the formality of introduction. One of these discovered a fancy for her. On several occasions he strolled home with her. "Let's stop in and have a rarebit," he suggested one midnight. "Very well," said Carrie. In the rosy restaurant, filled with the merry lovers of late hours, she found herself criticizing this man. He was too stilted, too self-opinionated. He did not talk of anything that lifted her above the common run of clothes and material success. When it was all over, he smiled most graciously. "Got to go straight home, have you?" he said. "Yes," she answered, with an air of quiet understanding. "She's not so inexperienced as she looks," he thought, and thereafter his respect and ardor were increased. She could not help sharing in Lola's love for a good time. There were days when they went carriage riding, nights when after the show they dined, afternoons when they strolled along Broadway, tastefully dressed. She was getting in the metropolitan whirl of pleasure. At last her picture appeared in one of the weeklies. She had not known of it, and it took her breath. Miss Carrie Madenda, it was labeled. One of the favorites of the wives of Abdul Company. At Lola's advice she had had some pictures taken by Sereny. They had got one there. She thought of going down and buying a few copies of the paper, but remembered that there was no one she knew well enough to send them to. Only Lola, apparently, in all the world was interested. The metropolis is a cold place socially, and Carrie soon found that a little money brought her nothing. The world of wealth and distinction was quite as far away as ever. She could feel that there was no warm, sympathetic friendship back of the easy merriment with which many approached her. All seemed to be seeking their own amusement, regardless of the possible sad consequence to others. So much for the lessons of Hurstwood and Druitt. In April she learned that the opera would probably last until the middle or the end of May, according to the size of the audiences. Next season it would go on the road. She wondered if she would be with it. As usual, Miss Osborne, owing to her moderate salary, was for securing a home engagement. "They're putting on a summer play at the casino," she announced, after figuratively putting her ear to the ground. "Let's try and get in that." "I'm willing," said Carrie. They tried in time and were apprised of the proper date to apply again. That was May 16th. Meanwhile their own show closed May 5th. "Those that want to go with the show next season," said the manager, "will have to sign this week." "Don't you sign," advised Lola. "I wouldn't go." "I know," said Carrie, "but maybe I can't get anything else." "Well, I won't," said the little girl, who had a resource in her admirers. "I went once and I didn't have anything at the end of the season." Carrie thought this over. She had never been on the road. "We can get along," added Lola. "I always have." Carrie did not sign. The manager who was putting on the summer skit at the casino had never heard of Carrie, but the several notices she had received, her published picture, and the program bearing her name had some little weight with him. He gave her a silent part at $30 a week. "Didn't I tell you?" said Lola. "It doesn't do you any good to go away from New York. They forget all about you if you do." Now, because Carrie was pretty, the gentleman who made up the advance illustrations of shows about to appear for the Sunday papers selected Carrie's photo along with others to illustrate the announcement. Because she was very pretty, they gave it excellent space and drew scrolls about it. Carrie was delighted. Still, the management did not seem to have seen anything of it. At least, no more attention was paid to her than before. At the same time there seemed very little in her part. It consisted of standing around in all sorts of scenes, a silent little Quakeress. The author of the skit had fancied that a great deal could be made of such a part, given to the right actress, But now, since it had been doled out to Carrie, he would as lief have had it cut out. "Don't kick, old man," remarked the manager. "If it don't go the first week we will cut it out." Carrie had no warning of this halcyon intention. She practiced her part ruefully, feeling that she was effectually shelved. At the dress rehearsal she was disconsolate. "That isn't so bad," said the author, the manager noting the curious effect which Carrie's blues had upon the part. "Tell her to frown a little more when Sparks dances." Carrie did not know it, but there was the least show of wrinkles between her eyes and her mouth was puckered quaintly. "Frown a little more, Miss Madenda," said the stage manager. Carrie instantly brightened up, thinking he had meant it as a rebuke. "No, frown," he said. "Frown as you did before." Carrie looked at him in astonishment. "I mean it," he said. "Frown hard when Mr. Sparks dances. I want to see how it looks." It was easy enough to do. Carrie scowled. The effect was something so quaint and droll it caught even the manager. "That is good," he said. "If she'll do that all through, I think it will take." Going over to Carrie, he said, "Suppose you try frowning all through. Do it hard. Look mad. It'll make the part really funny." On the opening night it looked to Carrie as if there were nothing to her part, after all. The happy, sweltering audience did not seem to see her in the first act. She frowned and frowned, but to no effect. Eyes were riveted upon the more elaborate efforts of the stars. In the second act, the crowd, wearied by a dull conversation, roved with its eyes about the stage and sighted her. There she was, gray-suited, sweet-faced, demure, but scowling. At first the general idea was that she was temporarily irritated, that the look was genuine and not fun at all. As she went on frowning, looking now at one principal and now at the other, the audience began to smile. The portly gentlemen in the front rows began to feel that she was a delicious little morsel. It was the kind of frown they would have loved to force away with kisses. All the gentlemen yearned toward her. She was capital. At last, the chief comedian, singing in the center of the stage, noticed a giggle where it was not expected. Then another and another. When the place came for loud applause it was only moderate. What could be the trouble? He realized that something was up. All at once, after an exit, he caught sight of Carrie. She was frowning alone on the stage and the audience was giggling and laughing. "By George, I won't stand that," thought the thespian. "I'm not going to have my work cut up by someone else. Either she quits that when I do my turn or I quit." "Why, that's all right," said the manager, when the kick came. "That's what she's supposed to do. You needn't pay any attention to that." "But she ruins my work." "No, she don't," returned the former, soothingly. "It's only a little fun on the side." "It is, eh?" exclaimed the big comedian. "She killed my hand all right. I'm not going to stand that." "Well, wait until after the show. Wait until tomorrow. We'll see what we can do." The next act, however, settled what was to be done. Carrie was the chief feature of the play. The audience, the more it studied her, the more it indicated its delight. Every other feature paled beside the quaint, teasing, delightful atmosphere which Carrie contributed while on the stage. Manager and company realized she had made a hit. The critics of the daily papers completed her triumph. There were long notices in praise of the quality of the burlesque, touched with recurrent references to Carrie. The contagious mirth of the thing was repeatedly emphasized. Miss Madenda presents one of the most delightful bits of character work ever seen on the casino stage, observed the sage critic of the Sunday. It is a bit of quiet, unassuming drollery which warms like good wine. Evidently the part was not intended to take precedence, as Miss Madenda is not often on the stage, but the audience, with the characteristic perversity of such bodies, selected for itself. The little Quakeress was marked for a favorite the moment she appeared, and thereafter easily held attention and applause. The vagaries of fortune are indeed curious. The critic of the Evening World, seeking as usual to establish a catchphrase which should go with the town, wound up by advising, "If you wish to be merry, see Carrie frown." The result was miraculous so far as Carrie's fortune was concerned. Even during the morning she received a congratulatory message from the manager. "You seem to have taken the town by storm," he wrote. "This is delightful. I am as glad for your sake as for my own." The author also sent word. That evening when she entered the theater, the manager had a most pleasant greeting for her. "Mr. Stevens," he said, referring to the author, "is preparing a little song, which he would like you to sing next week." "Oh, I can't sing," returned Carrie. "It isn't anything difficult. It's something that is very simple," he says, "and would suit you exactly." "Of course, I wouldn't mind trying," said Carrie, archly. "Would you mind coming to the box office a few moments before you dress?" observed the manager, in addition. "There's a little matter I want to speak to you about." "Certainly," replied Carrie. In that latter place the manager produced a paper. "Now, of course," he said, "we want to be fair with you in the matter of salary. Your contract here only calls for $30 a week for the next 3 months. How would it do to make it, say, $150 a week and extend it for 12 months? "Oh, very well," said Carrie, scarcely believing her ears. "Supposing, then, you just sign this." Carrie looked and beheld a new contract made out like the other one, with the exception of the new figures of salary and time. With a hand trembling from excitement she affixed her name. "$150 a week," she murmured, when she was again alone. She found, after all, as what millionaire has not that there was no realizing, in consciousness, the meaning of large sums. It was only a shimmering, glittering phrase in which lay a world of possibilities. Down in a third-rate Bleecker Street hotel, the brooding Hearst would read the dramatic item covering Carrie's success, without at first realizing who was meant. Then suddenly it came to him and he read the whole thing over again. "That's her, all right, I guess," he said. Then he looked about upon a dingy, moth-eaten hotel lobby. "I guess she struck it," he thought, a picture of the old shiny, plush-covered world coming back, with its lights, its ornaments, its carriages, and flowers. Ah, she was in the walled city now. Its splendid gates had opened, admitting her from a cold, dreary outside. She seemed a creature afar off like every other celebrity he had known. "Well, let her have it," he said. "I won't bother her." It was the grim resolution of a bent, bedraggled, but unbroken pride.